The thing Mara remembered most about her mother's hands was the way they smelled like turmeric and engine oil, a combination that should have been wrong but wasn't, the way certain chords shouldn't work but do. Her mother had been a mechanic before the Veth arrived. She'd been a lot of things before the Veth arrived. Now Mara stood at the edge of the compound wall at 4 in the morning and thought about hands, because thinking about anything else, the drop, the guards, the sensors, the fact that she was 22 years old and had never once broken a law in her life, made her stomach seize up and refuse to cooperate. The wall was 3 meters of poured alien aggregate, smooth as glass, faintly bioluminescent at the seams where the Veth had spliced their own structural biology into the concrete. It glowed the pale, digestive green of something that had recently eaten. Mara hated that color. She hated most of what the Veth had built on this world, but the color in particular felt like a specific personal insult, like they had chosen it deliberately to make every human structure nearby look brown and dead by comparison. She adjusted the strap of her bag and told her stomach to get it together. 12 days ago, the Veth administrative sector had reclassified Block 7, her block, the one where her mother lived, where 1,400 humans occupied prefab housing in a loose grid around a shared water processor, from provisional residential to economic recovery zone. Nobody had explained what that meant in practical terms for 3 days. When the explanation came, it came as a reduction. Food allotments cut by 40%. Medical supplements suspended pending resource audit. The shared processor throttled to 6 hours of active flow per day. Her mother, Deo, had a degenerative condition of the inner ear that the Veth called untreatable, and that the human doctors in Block 7 called undertreated. She needed a specific nutritional supplement, a dense, protein-loaded paste the Veth produced in abundance for their own consuming population, to keep the neuromuscular cascade that came with the condition from progressing. Without it, the tremors got worse. Without the tremors being managed, Deo couldn't eat. Without eating, the rest followed in a direction Mara refused to finish thinking about. The supplement was available at the Veth distribution centers, for Veth citizens, at a cost that a human in an economic recovery zone could not meet in 6 months of standard labor credits, let alone the 12 days her mother had left before the last of their stockpile ran out. So here Mara was, at 4 in the morning, with a bag and a borrowed set of electromagnetic pulse strips she didn't entirely know how to use, and a working knowledge of where the supplemental stores were located inside the compound, because she had spent 8 days at her cleaner's post in the Eastern Annex and had paid very close attention. She didn't let herself think about what happened to humans caught stealing from a Veth compound. She had heard things. Everyone had heard things. She thought instead about the smell of turmeric and engine oil, and she went over the wall. The pulse strips killed the sensor array for exactly 90 seconds, which was exactly what the man who'd sold them to her had promised, and which gave her just enough time to cross the courtyard at a run, slip through the service door she'd propped open 3 shifts ago with a wedge of insulation foam, and get into the storage corridor before the array came back online. She stood in the dark with her back against the wall and counted her own heartbeats until she was sure she wasn't going to throw up. Then she moved. The supplement stores were in sub-level 2, behind a partition that required a Veth biometric key she didn't have. She had planned for this. The partition had a manual override panel, an emergency access point required by the same interplanetary construction codes that applied to human buildings, because the Veth had agreed to those codes when they signed the provisional settlement 40 years ago, and they were, whatever else you said about them, meticulous about formal compliance. The panel required a code. The code was 6 digits. Mara had watched the supply technician enter it 47 times across 8 shifts, and had committed it to the specific kind of involuntary memory that the brain reserves for things you see over and over without trying to memorize them. The way you know the layout of a room you've cleaned every day for a month. She entered the code. The panel clicked. She went in. She found the supplement canisters racked in pale gold rows, each one enough to last a human 3 weeks, each one light enough to carry, each one worth more in labor credits than she would earn in half a year. She took 3. She told herself 3 was enough to give her time to find another way, a longer-term solution, something legitimate that she'd been too exhausted and too scared to locate before now. She told herself she wasn't being greedy. She told herself a lot of things in the 90 seconds she stood in that room. Then the lights came on. Not the emergency lights. The full lights, flooding the sublevel in that particular Veth frequency that sat just at the edge of the human visible spectrum and always made Mara feel slightly nauseous, like the light itself was slightly too alive. She turned around. There were 3 of them. The Veth were not, by human standards, large. They averaged 2.5 meters, bilaterally symmetrical in a way that human eyes registered as almost correct, and therefore more unsettling than something genuinely alien would have been. Their integument was layered, chitinous over softer tissue beneath, in colors that shifted with their emotional state. The 3 in front of Mara were currently a deep, arterial violet, which she knew from the orientation sessions she'd been required to attend as a new compound worker meant something between outrage and satisfaction. Like they'd been waiting for this. Like catching her was a thing they'd been looking forward to. The tallest one spoke. Not in English. The Veth's administrative AI handled translation, and the device on its collar emitted the English rendering a half-second after the actual speech, giving every Veth communication a faint, ghostly quality, as if you were hearing an echo before the sound. "You have accessed a restricted storage area," the translation said. "You have removed Veth nutritional property. You are in violation of settlement code 741 through 749. This is being recorded." Myra said, "I know." There was a pause. The lead Veth's coloration shifted, the violet darkening at the edges. "You do not deny the violation." "No," she held the canisters against her chest. They were cold. "My mother is sick. She needs these. I couldn't buy them and I couldn't get them any other way." Another pause, longer. The Veth communicated with each other in a frequency range she couldn't hear, but she could see the micro-movements in their collar integument that meant they were doing it. The conversation was quick. When the lead one looked back at her, its coloration had shifted to something she didn't have a name for, not in the administrative orientation sessions, not in any of the color charts they'd been given. A deep, almost cold blue, shot through with threads of something luminescent. "We are aware of the reclassification in Block 7, it said. "We are aware of the impact on supplemental distribution." Mara waited. "This does not change the violation." "I know," she said again. "You will come with us." She went. They didn't put her in a detention cell. They put her in what the compound's internal maps labeled a processing suite, which turned out to be a large room with no furniture and walls that were warm to the touch, walls that pulsed faintly with the same bioluminescence as the compound's exterior. She sat on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit, and because her legs were done cooperating. She still had the canisters. Nobody had taken them, which either meant something or meant nothing, and she couldn't tell which. The lead Veth came back alone after an hour. Its coloration had settled into something she'd never seen before, a soft, almost silver blue, the color of still water in the first light before sunrise. "Our governance council has reviewed your case," the translation said. It remained standing at the room's far side, and in the flat white light of the processing suite, Mara could see the chitinous layering of its integument more clearly than she ever had across the compound courtyard. There was something delicate under all of it, something that looked, from this angle, almost like it could be hurt. "Under Settlement Code 7411, it continued, "first violations by non-citizen residents may be resolved through alternative remediation rather than criminal processing. What does that mean? Another pause. The faint sound of that infrasonic conversation she couldn't hear. It means we may choose a different consequence. She didn't like the way it said consequence. She said nothing. The compound has been authorized to administer a VETH biometric integration protocol, it said. It is a procedure. It would alter your physiology in specific ways. After the procedure, you would not be able to steal from us again. Her chest went cold. What kind of alteration? Significant, the VETH said, and she could have sworn that its coloration just for a moment went a shade she could only describe as apologetic. She thought about her mother. She thought about 12 days of supplement left. She thought about the tremors in her mother's hands, those hands that had smelled like turmeric and engine oil, that could fix an engine or braid a child's hair with equal steadiness, and how the tremors were getting worse. She thought about the way Deo had looked at her 2 nights ago across the table of their prefab unit, soup cooling in front of her, because she couldn't hold the spoon reliably anymore, and had said, "Mara, baby, I need you to stop worrying about me and start worrying about yourself." "Will it hurt?" Mara asked. "Yes," the VETH said without the usual lag, the most direct thing it had said all night. She closed her eyes. She held the canisters against her chest. She said, "All right." She meant all right, I'll take it. She meant all right, just don't touch the canisters, don't take them away, let me send them to my mother first. She meant 100 things she didn't say out loud, and the VETH stood in its silver-blue silence and seemed to understand that she meant all of them. "The canisters will be delivered," it said, "to the individual in question. That is part of the agreement." She opened her eyes. "You're not going to make it part of my punishment not to give them to her?" "No," the VETH said. "A child's attempt to feed a parent is not something we punish by preventing the feeding." She stared at it. It looked back at her, or she thought it did. The VETH had no external eyes in the human sense, only the light-sensitive integument that ran in a band around the widest part of their head structure, and Mara had never quite gotten used to the experience of being looked at from all directions at once. "What are you?" she asked, and she didn't mean its species. She meant this specific one. This one that spoke without the half-second lag when it wanted to, that stood in its silver blue, and told her a child feeding a parent wasn't something you punished by stopping the feeding. "I am the compound's biointegration officer," the translation said. It sounded for a moment almost wry. "It is my work to administer consequences." "And you're good at your work." "I am thorough," it said. The procedure took 4 hours. She wasn't awake for most of it, and she was grateful for that. What she remembered was the table, which was warm the way the walls were warm, and the sound of the VETH moving around her in the dark, and a pain that started as pressure and built into something she had no vocabulary for because it wasn't like anything she'd felt before, not injury, not illness, not the specific ache of long exhaustion. It was the sensation of something adding itself to her at a cellular level, something enormous and patient deciding to make room inside a space that had been built for a different scale. She woke up on the floor of the processing suite. Then she noticed the floor was further away than it should have been. She sat up. The ceiling, which had been 3 meters above her when she'd been brought in, was now at approximately the level of her forehead. She held up one hand. It was large enough that she could have covered her own previous face with it. Mara sat on the floor of the processing suite, 4.5 meters tall, and had several seconds of extremely loud internal experience that she did not make any sound during because the ceiling was right there, and she didn't have any room. The biointegration officer was there. Of course it was there. It stood near the door that now came up to somewhere around Mara's solar plexus, and its coloration was the silver blue again, and she thought, in the way that your brain delivers observations during a crisis, that it was smaller than she remembered. Everything was smaller than she remembered. "The procedure is complete," the translation said. The integration is stable. Your biological functions are maintained. You are currently 4.6 meters in height. This is the intended result. Mara looked at her hands. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the door. She looked at the biointegration officer, which had to tip the band of its head integument upward to look back at her, and she thought, they made me too big to steal. That was the logic. She was too large to fit through service corridors, too large to access storage systems designed for Veth-scale operators, too large to move through a compound undetected, too large to do anything in the human scale of the world without causing significant disruption. The consequence that couldn't be repealed, the alteration that was its own enforcement. She was too big to steal. She was too big for her home. She was too big for her mother's table, her mother's door, her mother's arms around her. She put that thought somewhere interior and locked it. She'd deal with it later when there was room. The canisters, she said. Her voice was different now. Deeper, with a resonance she could feel in her sternum, which was a strange thing to feel from the inside. You said they'd be delivered. They have been, the translation said, to Block 7, to the individual named in your intake file. An escort was sent directly. She breathed in and out. The room was very small, and after this. What happens to me after this? You are free to go, the translation said, and then there was the faint shift in its coloring, and it added, within your constraints. Her constraints, right, the door. She looked at the door, then at the wall beside the door, then made a decision that she suspected would define a great many things going forward. She put both hands flat against the wall. The wall, which had been warm and pulsing, went very still under her palms, and she was aware of the building's biointegration, the Veth's own organic technology in the structure itself, responding to the pressure the way a living thing responds to contact, not fighting her, not yielding either. She pushed. The wall didn't so much break as decide to let her through. The aggregates separated in a way that was almost surgical, the seams splitting along the biological lines built into the material, and Mara walked out of the processing suite into the main corridor of Sublevel 2, and had to duck and turn sideways, and still clipped the door frame hard enough that she felt it in her shoulder. The corridor was empty. It wouldn't be empty for long. She went up. She had time to think while she was navigating the infrastructure of the compound at 4.5 meters tall in the pre-dawn dark, which was a strange kind of time to have, but she was grateful for it. Her brain, which had apparently decided that the situation called for extremely calm and linear processing, worked through the following in approximately the time it took her to find a way to the surface. Her mother had the supplements. She was no longer going to be able to go back to the prefab unit in Block 7, not through any door currently in existence, not without significant renovation. She was going to be seen, immediately, comprehensively, and irrevocably. There was no version of her current situation that involved not being seen. The Veth had made her into a deterrent, a demonstration, a visible consequence of what happened when you crossed them. That was the actual logic, not just making her too big to steal, but making her too big to ignore, too big to miss, too big to forget. Every human in the settlement would see what happened. Every human in the settlement would understand. She got that. She understood the mechanism. She even, in a cold and abstracted way, respected the elegance of it. You didn't imprison someone. You didn't execute them. You made them into a monument to their own transgression, visible from a distance, unable to disappear into ordinary life. She emerged through a section of outer compound wall. It gave way with less resistance than the interior had, as if the building had decided she was more dangerous to contain than to release, into the pale gray of pre-dawn over the settlement, and she stood upright for the first time since the procedure, and everything was smaller than her memory of it. The settlement stretched out around the compound in its familiar grid, the prefab units in their rows, the paths between them worn smooth by years of human feet, The shared water processor at Block 7's center with its mismatched repair panels from 5 different maintenance cycles. She could see all of it from here. She could see the lights coming on in windows as the early risers started their day. The pale rectangles warming to yellow as people moved inside small spaces and began the rituals of mourning. She could see her mother's unit, Unit 7114, third row from the eastern edge. She'd grown up in that unit. She knew from this distance, which would have been 3 minutes of walking at her old scale, which light was the kitchen and which was the bedroom, and which was the single window in the common room that had a crack in the sealant they'd been waiting on compound maintenance to fix for 8 months. The kitchen light was on. Mara sat down at the edge of the compound wall. The movement was more complicated than it used to be. Her body had its own new geometry, its own center of gravity placed differently than she was used to. And she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has just been informed that they are now large enough to damage things they used to walk past without noticing. She sat, and the ground accepted her weight, and she looked at Unit 7114 and the kitchen light and thought about what her mother must be doing in there right now. She thought about the supplement canisters, delivered, the biointegration officer had said. She thought about Deo opening the door at 4 in the morning and finding a Veth escort on the step with 3 gold canisters of nutrition supplement, and the expression on her face in that moment, and the way she would have brought them inside and set them on the kitchen counter with the same calm steadiness she applied to everything. To engines, to dinner, to a frightened child who didn't understand why the lights in the sky had come down and started telling everyone what to do. She thought about Deo not yet knowing where the canisters had come from, not yet knowing what had happened. She thought about all the things she was going to have to figure out: housing, work, the entirely new set of physical facts that governed her existence. The Veth had made her into a monument, yes, but they had made her out of a material that was, as it turned out, already pretty difficult to destroy. The sun was starting to come up. The settlement was starting to move. She could hear it at this scale in a way she'd never been able to before, the individual sounds of 1,400 humans beginning their day, layered over each other in a texture that she found, to her own surprise, profoundly reassuring. The settlement was alive. It was doing what it did every morning, and she was still in it. She did not know how long she sat there, long enough for the sun to clear the eastern ridge. Long enough for the paths between the units to fill with people heading toward the water processor, toward the distribution points, toward the morning's work. Long enough for one of them to stop at the edge of the block and look up at her. It was a child, 10, maybe 11, in the gray provisional residential coverall that all the block children wore to the compound work prep sessions. The child stood on the path with a carry pack over one shoulder and looked up at Mara with an expression that was not fear. It was the expression children have when they encounter something that doesn't fit the categories they've been given and are trying to decide whether to invent a new category or borrow one from a story. The child said, "Are you a person?" "Yes," Mara said. Her new voice, careful and low, still carried. The child didn't flinch. "Why are you so big?" "The Veth did something to me." The child processed this. "Why?" "Because I took something." Another pause. "What did you take?" "Food for my mother." The child looked at her for a long time. Then it said, "That doesn't seem fair," with the absolute conviction that children have about matters of justice, the kind of conviction that adults spend years learning to qualify. Mara said, "No, it doesn't." The child's name, it turned out, was Pell. Pell stayed and talked to her while the settlement woke up fully around them, and other people stopped and looked, and the radius of people looking expanded outward through the block like a signal propagating through a medium. Nobody ran. Nobody screamed. There was a particular quality to the attention she was getting, cautious, assessing, the way people look at something they are trying to figure out. That was not the look of fear and not quite the look of hope, but was the look you give something before you decide whether to be afraid or hopeful, when you're still gathering information. The Veth came at mid-morning. Not the biointegration officer. These were Veth from the administrative sector, in the formal integument covering that marked them as governance representatives, and their coloring was the same deep violet she'd seen in the compound at 4 in the morning, outrage and satisfaction combined. They arrived in a formation of 6 at the edge of Block 7, with a translation array that broadcast rather than whispered, so the whole block could hear. Mara Osai, the broadcast said, you are in violation of your remediation terms. You are to return to the compound for monitoring and containment. She was sitting cross-legged in the open space near the water processor. Around her, at what they had evidently decided was a respectful distance, most of Block 7 had gathered. Some of them were sitting. Some were standing. Pell was sitting directly next to her left knee, eating breakfast out of a container and narrating the situation to a smaller child who had arrived later and needed to be caught up. Mara looked at the 6 Veth governance representatives. She looked at their translation array. She looked at the violet of their coloring, the outrage, the satisfaction, the certainty that the mechanism would work the way mechanisms were supposed to work. I wasn't told there were monitoring terms, she said. Her voice, amplified by its new depth, didn't need to project. It simply arrived. Your remediation agreement. I agreed to the procedure, she said. Nobody mentioned containment. She looked at the people around her, at the faces she recognized, and the ones she didn't, at Pell's upturned face, at the woman in the 3rd row who worked the same annex she did and was watching with her arms folded and her expression very still and attentive. I agreed to a consequence. I'm living with it. But I didn't agree to go into a box. The Veth communicated in their infrasonic frequency for several seconds. The compound, the broadcast said, is the appropriate environment for an individual of your current dimensions. The block, she said, is where I live, where my mother lives. I'll need new housing arrangements, obviously. The unit's not going to work, but I'm not leaving the block. More infrasonic, longer this time. You represent a disruption to the settlement's normal operations, the broadcast said, and there was something in the translation's tone, not designed emotion, just the flat delivery of a statement that the translation AI was rendering as faithfully as it could, that made the statement sound almost uncertain. As if the governance representatives had prepared for defiance and found instead something harder to manage. A calm refusal. A person sitting in the sun next to a child eating breakfast and declining politely to go anywhere. I represent a person, she said, who lives here, who is going to keep living here. She paused. I'd like to talk to your resource council about the reclassification of Block 7, about the supplement allotments, not as a complaint, as a negotiation. The violet of their coloring shifted. She watched it shift. She'd never been able to see it so clearly from a distance before. You, the lead representative said, and the translation had a faint quality she couldn't name, wish to negotiate. I'm sitting in the middle of a settlement full of people, she said. I'm large enough to be seen from the compound. I'm large enough that if I decide to walk somewhere, it's noticeable. You made me into a visible thing. That visibility cuts in multiple directions. Another long infrasonic silence. We will, the lead representative said finally, convey your request. They left. Block 7 erupted in the complicated collective sound of 1,400 people processing something together. Some of it laughter, some of it something that was trying to decide whether to be applause and hadn't committed yet, some of it the quiet, specific sound of people exchanging looks. The woman from the Eastern Annex walked up to her. She was small, the way everyone was small from here, but she walked the way she always had in the Annex, like she was taking up exactly the space she intended to take up and not negotiating on the matter. That was interesting, the woman said. It was the only thing I could think of, Mara said honestly. No, the woman shook her head. You had other options. You chose that one. That's different. Her name was Comfort, Mara learned, and she had been in the settlement for 19 years and had outlasted 3 separate governance reclassifications and knew more about settlement code than anyone in the block, because she had made it her work to know, because she had understood from the beginning that the codes were the only leverage that didn't require you to be bigger than the people holding the power. Until, apparently, someone was actually bigger. They talked for a long time, she and Comfort, while the settlement moved around them and Pell fell asleep against Mara's ankle. They talked about the reclassification and the supplement allotments, and the specific clauses of the settlement agreement that the Veth had arguably violated in implementing the resource cuts, and what a formal remediation request looked like versus what an informal negotiation might achieve. Mara told her what she'd said to the governance representatives. Comfort told her what she should have said, and what she should say next time, and what the long game looked like. Her mother came at noon. She heard her before she saw her, the specific rhythm of Deo's footsteps, which she'd known her whole life, and which were currently navigating the path from 7114, with a careful steadiness that meant the tremors were present but managed. Mara looked up from the conversation and watched her mother come through the settlement toward her, and her mother didn't look surprised. Her mother looked like someone who had spent the morning alone in a kitchen with 3 gold canisters of nutrition supplement and several hours to think, and had arrived at a specific internal position on the matter. Deo walked up to her daughter's knee. She put her hand on it, her hand which smelled like turmeric and engine oil. She looked up. You went over the wall, she said, not a question. Yes, Mara said. I told you not to worry about me. I know. Deo was quiet for a moment. She looked at the scale of her daughter, the changed geometry, the new dimensions, the way Mara was sitting cross-legged in the dust of the water processor's square like someone who had decided this was where she lived and wasn't particularly interested in going anywhere else. She looked at Comfort, and at Pell still asleep against Mara's other ankle, and at the gathered members of the block going about the ordinary business of mid-morning around the extraordinary fact of her child. Are you in pain? Deo asked. Not anymore. Are you afraid? Mara thought about it honestly, not of the Veth. Deo nodded. She sat down on the ground next to her daughter's knee and reached up and took Mara's hand, the new large one, in both of her own. She didn't say anything else for a while. She just held it, and Mara looked down at her mother sitting in the sun with her face tipped up, and the supplement that would keep her well delivered in her hands, those hands, wrapped around her daughter's, and thought. This is what the Veth did not factor in. They had calculated size. They had calculated visibility. They had calculated the deterrent value of an impossible consequence. They had not calculated this, the thing that doesn't get smaller when you make it bigger, the thing that scales up with everything else and becomes, at 4.5 meters, simply larger and more present and more immovable than it was before. Comfort pulled something out of her carry bag and set it in front of Deo, a container, food from the morning distribution. She hasn't eaten, Comfort said, nodding at Mara with the brisk practicality of someone who had been handling logistics for 19 years. Neither have you, I imagine. Deo looked at the container. She looked up at Mara. Can you? I can figure it out, Mara said. Give me a minute. She could. It required some improvisation involving a flat section of compound wall that had come down somewhere along the way and that someone had helpfully dragged over at some point in the morning. She didn't know when. She had been talking and hadn't noticed until now, and a certain amount of negotiation with the new physical facts of her hands, which were precise enough but operated at a scale that required her to relearn the distinction between contact and force. But she managed it. She and her mother ate in the noon sun, while Comfort outlined the specifics of the formal remediation request they were going to file under Settlement Code 427, and Pell woke up and complained about missing lunch, and was told by 3 different adults that there was a distribution run in an hour, and to have some patience. And the water processor cycled through its midday flow, and the block moved around them in its ordinary afternoon shapes. The council meeting happened 6 days later. Mara sat outside the administrative building. She didn't fit inside, and spoke through a translation array Comfort had sourced from a settlement technician who had opinions about the resource cuts, and was therefore very motivated to be helpful. The governance council sat inside with the windows open. It was a strange meeting, in that she was, by the standards of anything that had ever happened in a VETH administrative proceeding, physically impossible to dismiss or defer or reschedule in the hope that she would lose interest. She knew every clause they cited. Comfort had walked her through all of it. She knew where the codes had been respected and where they'd been strained and where they'd been technically complied with in a way that violated the intent. She knew because she'd spent 6 days doing nothing but learning it, sitting in the square of Block 7 with Comfort beside her, and a settlement worth of people cycling past and stopping and adding things they knew, things they'd noticed, things they'd documented and never known what to do with. 1,400 people, and it turned out that between them they knew a remarkable amount about their own situation. They just hadn't had anywhere to put it until someone sat down in the middle of the square and started collecting it. The supplement allotments were restored, all of them to all blocks. The council cited logistical recalibration as the reason. Nobody used the word negotiation. The biointegration officer came to see her the day after the council meeting. It came alone in the early evening and found her where she usually was these days in the square, with a larger-than-usual contingent of children who had decided she was the best climbing structure available and were exercising this opinion with enthusiasm. She was letting them. It was better than sitting still and thinking too hard about the things she was still getting used to. The officer stood at the edge of the square in its silver-blue coloring and looked at her, and she looked back. "The council," the translation said, "is displeased with the outcome of the negotiation. I know. You were meant to be a deterrent. I know. A visible consequence." Its coloring shifted slightly, impossible to ignore. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what I am." The officer was quiet for a moment. One of the children slid down her arm and landed with a practiced roll in the dust, and got up immediately to climb back up, and the officer watched this with its full integument band. "Our council," it said, "did not anticipate this configuration." "People usually don't," Mara said. "They think making something bigger makes it easier to contain." "We were incorrect." "You were." She studied it. The silver blue. The quality she'd been trying to name since the first time she'd seen it in the processing suite, and that she had a name for now after 6 days of thinking, while the settlement moved around her, and her mother ate and regained steadiness, and Comfort turned her into something more dangerous than a thief. The quality was careful attention. The kind of attention that didn't come from satisfaction or outrage or any of the violet shades of enforcement. The kind of attention you paid when you were genuinely trying to understand something. "You could have refused," it said. "The procedure." "Yes, you could have chosen criminal processing, detention, a conventional sentence." "No," she said, "I couldn't." She didn't explain further, and it didn't ask. "You knew," it said, and it wasn't a question exactly or an accusation. It had the quality of an observation made out loud by someone still working through the logic of it. "Before, when you agreed, you knew you would find a way to make it." The translation hesitated in its characteristic half-second lag, but this time the hesitation seemed genuine, as if the AI was searching for the word the officer had chosen and not finding an equivalent. "Workable." "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I didn't know anything except that my mother needed those supplements, and I was going to make that happen and deal with everything else after." She looked at the children on her arms, at the square, at the lights coming on in the block windows as the day ended. "The after is larger than I expected, but I'm managing." The officer's coloring did something she'd never seen before. Not silver blue, not violet. Something between, a color she didn't have a name for in English or any other language, that she suspected existed only in the palette of something that had just encountered a category it hadn't previously needed. The procedure is reversible, it said. It was not presented to you as such, because the reversibility is conditional and the conditions are administratively complex. But it is reversible. She went very still. You would be required to demonstrate, it said, sustained non-violation of settlement codes for a period of not less than 2 years, and there is a council review. The outcome is not guaranteed. She looked at the square, at Comfort, who was 60 meters away talking to the water processor technician about a valve that needed replacing, at the path to 7114, where the kitchen light was already on and where Deo was making dinner, at Pell, who had given up climbing and was sitting on her foot drawing something in a small notebook with intense concentration. She thought about going back to the annex, to the service corridors, to the scale of a world that had been built for her. She thought about fitting through her mother's door. She thought about the chair at her mother's table and the smell of the kitchen, and what it would feel like to sit in a space that was sized for her instead of sitting very carefully outside one. She thought about the last 6 days. 2 years is a long time, she said. Yes. A lot can happen in 2 years. Yes, the officer said, and then, without the lag in what she'd come to recognize as its unfiltered register, it already has. She looked at it, it looked back. I'll think about it, she said. It inclined its head structure in the way she'd seen it do once before, in the processing suite, that gesture that had no translation equivalent but that she'd decided, on no evidence, meant something like, I understand. It left. Pell looked up from the notebook. What did it want? To tell me something, Mara said. What? That there might be another way. Pell considered this with the gravity children apply to important information. Will you take it? She watched the settlement move in the evening light, the paths filling with the end-of-shift crowd, the processors hum, the lights going on in the units, one by one, each one a small, warm fact. Her mother's kitchen at the end of the 3rd row, where dinner was being made. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But she was thinking about it. And thinking, for her, had a history of leading to action, and action had a history of leading to consequences, and consequences, as it turned out, had a history of being larger and stranger and more negotiable than anyone expected. Her mother called. The sound carried clearly in the evening air Deo's voice, the particular inflection she'd used since Mara was small for the specific instruction to come eat, and the whole block was quiet enough in that moment that everyone in earshot heard it, and several people smiled at the ground in front of them with the small private smiles of people who have witnessed something and aren't sure it has a name. Mara got up. It took a moment, the way everything took a moment now, the moment of recalibrating to the new geometry of herself. Then she walked, carefully and slowly, down the 3rd row, and she sat down in the dust outside her mother's door because she couldn't go through it, and her mother came out and sat in the doorframe with 2 bowls of food and passed one up to her, and they ate their dinner together in the quiet of the evening, the world arranged around them at whatever scale it needed to be, and the sky above them big enough for both.